We've done this for a number of years. Susan and I, on tomorrow, Monday in the evening, we are welcoming all of the folks who are part of the LGBT plus community in St. Luke's and affirmers, family members, others who are affirming. Join us at the house for ice cream. And what time are we doing that, Joel? 7 o'clock, isn't it? So we got one gathering tonight, but it's a different time tomorrow. 7 o'clock tomorrow. So if you want to find out more, I'm going to be out in the hallway after the service, and we'd love to have you come and join us and others in St. Luke's. As it was a beautiful day. As we get ready for the message this morning, I invite you to join me in a word of prayer. Oh, gracious and loving God, you are an affirming God. And you are a holy God. As we settle our spirit, as we receive the worship of the morning, speak to us now, gracious God. For your word is one which is always spoken and sustains. And with what we hear, may we be people who allow our words to add sustenance to others and our world. In Christ's name, amen. I think we got a fan up here. I think I'm hearing the fan on my microphone. I'll stand back a little bit from the fan this morning. February 7th, 1954, President Eisenhower sat in a church pew that Abraham Lincoln used to sit in at the New York Avenue Presbyterian Church in Washington, D.C. He was listening to a sermon by George Doherty advocating for what was a rising push in the United States to add the words "under God" to the Pledge of Allegiance. Those words were not in the original pledge written by Francis Bellamy in 1892. Those words, the first Pledge of Allegiance, went like this: I pledge allegiance to my flag and the republic for which it stands, one nation, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. That pledge was written to deepen a spirit of Americanization. There was a rising flood of immigrants coming into the United States, mostly from Europe, and most of those immigrants were Catholic. And there were Protestants who were concerned about what this was going to do to the American way of life. So this pledge was created to be part of a process of assimilation. It's an interesting thought because Francis Bellamy actually wrote those words intending for them to be used by any person from any country. It wasn't specifically for America. That's why he said, my flag and the republic for which it stands. But by 1923, the words were changed to say the flag of the United States of America. And about 30 years after that, our country would experience another concern that was rising. It was called the Red Scare, the fear of communism spreading in our country. And there were people who looked at nations like the USSR, China, and said, oh, they're godless countries. And so we want to do something that stands us apart from these communist nations to drive out any influence of communism in America. And so this push began to add the words under God, one nation under God. And a couple of months after that, in fact, it was today, June the 14th, 1954, President Eisenhower signed legislation to add those words. I remember standing in the first grade with my class, taught every morning. This is how we begin class. We stand. We are to put our hand over our heart, look at the flag and say, I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. If you learn that history about why those words were added, and it maybe it's a little disconcerting that the words under God got in there because of politics. Well, for people of faith. That should not make the pledge any less meaningful. In fact, President Eisenhower, right after he signed that legislation, said, "These words will remind Americans that despite our great physical strength, we must remain humble. They will help us to keep constantly in our minds and hearts the spiritual and moral principles which alone give dignity to people." Well, now that's not a bad intention, is it? To remain humble and respect the fact that the dignity of people is something that is given by God. Now, have we lived out those ideals in a perfect way as a nation? Mm-hmm. Here's the answer. Within the decade following the signing of that legislation, we would experience intense race riots, continued discrimination against indigenous peoples in America, even violence toward gay people. So no, we've struggled to live out these values as Americans, but again, as people of faith, it does not make the values wrong. Because these words should summon within us a desire to form a more perfect union. This is why we're doing this series for these 4 weeks leading up to this significant celebration in our country of our 250th anniversary. We're going to look at 4 important statements in historical documents from our nation and think about them as people of faith, because these words point to what is the source of American greatness. What makes America great is not our wealth, it's not our power, it's not our technology. The source of what makes America great is our ideas. Mark Trotter, a deceased United Methodist pastor, once preached a sermon on the 4th of July. He said, "This day celebrates an idea, a vision. America is the idea that people can live happily and prosperously and in peace with one another." Now, have we always lived that out well? No. But this is our call. And so today we begin with our first statement, this phrase from our Pledge of Allegiance: one nation under God. Now, I want us to think about that phrase in relation to biblical history, particularly from a geopolitical perspective. I've been really fortunate in my life to travel to Israel many times to study there. I even got to study under a renowned biblical archaeologist. And realizing that I'm going to be retiring in less than a year, I know that I don't have that many opportunities to inflict this knowledge on people. So, you are my targets today. So take a quick moment, turn to the person next to you and say, "I can't wait." All right, with eager faces looking at me, this screen shows the beginning of biblical history, which is also the beginning of human history. This is the Fertile Crescent in the area known as the cradle of civilization, where humanity started. That green arch is like a land bridge that connects the Mediterranean world to the world of Asia Minor. Below it is a desert that is not habitable. So in order for people to cross from one side to the other, they went through the fertile resources of this crescent where they would be able to endure and make the trip. And so it was that about 2 millennia before the birth of Jesus, a man named Terah took his son Abraham and his daughter-in-law Sarah and their cousin Lot, and they left their hometown of Ur in the Chaldeans, which is down in that lower region today in southern Iraq, and they went up into the Fertile Crescent. Now, why did they do this? We don't know. We're not told in the Bible. Chances are they said, "We have heard that there's a more prosperous life in another land. Maybe we can do well for our family to go there." So they went. and they settled in the city of Haran. At one point, the father Terah died. And it says in Genesis chapter 12 that the Lord spoke to Abraham. That is the beginning of biblical history. Everything that happens after this now, you can put a date on it. What God spoke to Abraham was what we call the Abrahamic covenant, a threefold promise. First, to give Abraham land in a place he would show him. And then in that land, he would have many descendants who would become a whole nation of people. And then number three, they would be blessed in order to be a blessing to the nations of the world. Now that threefold promise to Abraham is the basis of the rest of Scripture and the story. To be a blessing to the nations of the world in that land. And so they go south down the Fertile Crescent and they settle in the land of Canaan, which is modern day Israel. Now, have you ever wondered why there? Why did God tell Abraham to go to that land? I'm from North Carolina. Growing up, when I learned the story of Abraham, I thought, why didn't God call Abraham to go to North Carolina? We got mountains, we've got beaches, we've got mild winters, we've got Duke University, and heck, we've even got a pretty good hockey team in North Carolina now. But God did not call Abraham to go to North Carolina. Why did God call Abraham to go there? You have to think of the Bible geopolitically. That was land wedged between the superpowers of the world at that time. Egypt to the south and the empires of Asia Minor to the north, connected by that Fertile Crescent. And therefore, the route that took you from Egypt into Asia Minor became known as the Via Maris. It followed along the seacoast on that line that you see, stretching even further eastward. That was how you got from one to the other. It was the most powerful trade route in the world. Biblical archaeologist Yohanan Aharoni said of this place, the International Trunk Road, the so-called Way of the Sea, constituted the main economic and strategic backbone of the whole Fertile Crescent. So this was a very rich thoroughfare. The most significant resources of the world were passing through this Via Maris, and wherever there is a wealth of resources, there's what? Fighting over those resources. So think of the Via Maris as the ancient version of the Strait of Hormuz. That's what it was. Now, what does any of this have to do with one nation under God? Turn again to the person next to you and say, be patient, he's getting there, I think. Here's what it has to do with one nation under God. God called Abraham to go to the most politically significant land on earth and become a nation of people to be faithful to God. In other words, God does not call people to live their faith despite political realities. God calls people to live their faith in political realities. That's what Abraham has been called to do. And so, as I mentioned, this land becomes known for its fighting. In fact, there was a specific location where most of the strategic battles took place called the Jezreel Valley, an area of about 140 square miles west of the Sea of Galilee. The city that overlooked the Jezreel Valley was Megiddo. Megiddo was a strategic point so that whoever controlled Megiddo tended to control the outcome of the battles. So over time, a theory developed because so many of the northern and southern clashes happened right there in that valley. They talk about how the soil was soaked with the blood of soldiers. And so this theory developed that the ultimate battle that will determine the outcome of the world will happen in that valley. that the ultimate outcome of history is going to happen there. So whoever controls Megiddo controls the outcome of the world, and that's what became the theory of Armageddon. The word Armageddon derives from the name Megiddo. Now, of course, Christians look at Armageddon as something that describes the end of time, when there's going to be a cosmic battle between angels and demons. But Megiddo, Armageddon, goes back to a real place, a real location, with real issues going on in the world. And what Armageddon believes is that God's plan for the world is going to one day turn out victorious through the faithfulness of God's people. So the rest of the Old Testament is about the people being reminded, this is our mission. This is why we're here. We are to be God's representatives. So statements from prophets like Isaiah that we heard a moment ago are a reminder of who they are called to be. Happy is the nation whose God is the Lord, the people whom he has chosen as his heritage. One nation under God. But here's where sentences like this became problematic. When people interpreted happy is the nation that lives under God, they would want to turn that into our happiness is what God intends for us. We are a nation that is showed special favor by God to be better than other people, that God is on our side. And that is the source of our happiness. That's the source of our greatness. And so the prophets would rise up and remind the people, no, it isn't. God did not put us here so that God could favor us and bless us in a way that makes us better than other people. God put us here to be a light, to be an influence, to be a blessing to others. So the prophets would remind the people, learn to do good, seek justice, help the oppressed, defend the cause of orphans, fight for the rights of widows. The prophets would recall words from the Torah like, do not take advantage of foreigners who live among you in your land. Treat them like native-born Israelites and love them as you love yourself. They said to the people that their greatness doesn't depend on their strength. No king is saved by the size of his army. No warrior escapes by his great strength. But the eyes of the Lord are on those who fear him, on those whose hope is in his unfailing love. The people are reminded of the ways of God they're called to live. What other nation lived this way? None. There was no other nation being told, you treat the foreigner just like you treat your own citizens. Everyone would have said, that's ridiculous. They were not called to care for the needs of the poor and to make sure that they are looked after. This is what set the people apart. The values, the ideas, the vision by which they were called to exist. But the people would live with that tension, with whether they're to be on God's side or have a God who's on their side. You know, Abraham Lincoln was asked one time, do you believe God is on your side? Here's how he answered. My concern is not whether God is on our side. My greatest concern is whether we are on God's side, for God is always right. That's, in essence, what the prophets would remind Israel. And so the rest of the Old Testament is about the struggle of these people to live up to this call. And then you get to the New Testament. Then you come to the decisive step in which God entered human history. So that it's like God said, you know, for all of the preaching of my prophets, I'm just going to come among you myself, and I'm going to show you what I mean. I'm going to show you how living this way looks every day. And God came in the form of his son Jesus. And then after Jesus' death and resurrection, a new movement was launched. Now, it wasn't a new purpose, it was the same old movement. It was the same purpose of living these ways of justice and compassion and mercy for all people, to be a light to others, not to live for our own benefit and just to have God on our side. But here's what's different about Jesus' movement. Now, this movement of God is not associated with a nation. It's a movement committed to God's cause. This is what took Christianity about 100 years to become its own religion. For 100 years after the death and resurrection of Jesus, Christianity was understood as a movement within Judaism. But by 132 CE, in the second revolt of the Jews against the Romans, the Christians said, you know, Jesus talked about this. You're going to hear wars and rumors of wars, but this is not the end of things. So the Christians said, we're going to sit this one out. This just does not seem to be our fight. We are here to defend a cause, not a country. And so the Israelites said, if you don't fight with us, you're not one of us. That is when Christianity became a separate religion, not identified with a nation. Now, historically, we know that there are countries who established themselves as Christian nations, but they haven't turned out too well. I mean, think of Europe. Think of the nations of Europe that established themselves as Christian nations. Then they had a problem. Are we going to be Catholic or are we going to be Protestant? Some of the bloodiest wars in European history were over that fight. England fought those battles. And England eventually came down on the side of saying, we're going to be a Protestant nation, and they established the Church of England. And it just seemed clear and swell and easy until there were groups who came along and said, we want to see some changes in the church. And like every institution, the church does not seem to deal very well with reformers. And so the Church of England said to the Puritans, we think you'd be happier elsewhere. Why don't you guys get on a boat? And so they came to America. And they established a new land for the sake of religious freedom. So when you look at what our founders wrote into our historic documents as a nation, they were clear that they believed that our rights of freedom are spiritual rights, that they're God-given rights, but they were clear not to associate that with Christianity alone. That this is not a Christian nation. They said, Congress shall not establish any one religion, but we want to make sure people are protected in their freedom of religion. In other words, they recognized the tension to have your commitment to the values and the freedom of our nation, but to not let that become any one religious expression. And so here we are today, being called to wrestle with what does it mean to be one nation under God. To be a nation of people that puts ourselves under the values and the beliefs of God. In the traditional service this morning, an ensemble sang a song called Shalom. And it understands the deep Jewish meaning of shalom. That's not just peace, it's about human flourishing. And it's a very big word that touches on every aspect of life. It really is about the wholeness of society. This was the historic vision of God when God sent Abraham to live in a particular land. This is the vision of Jesus. This is the vision of the church. To be a people committed to living under the principles it takes for human flourishing throughout society. But too often, we struggle with whether we're going to be on God's side or we're going to get God on our side. So what's the greatest threat to that vision? What's the greatest threat to being one nation under God? I don't believe it's communism. I don't believe it's atheism. I don't believe it's religious pluralism. I believe the greatest threat to being one nation under God is Christian nationalism. It shouldn't be. It shouldn't be in principle. Because if a nation of people really lived the values of Jesus, then it's going to represent that human flourishing for all of society. But if you listen to Christian nationalism, you don't hear so much an emphasis for the care of the poor, for the justice of everybody. You hear a brand of religious beliefs that believes the nation exists for the sake of a narrow group. What it sounds like is a group of people wanting God to be on their side. That's why at our annual conference last week that met here, we approved a petition that was submitted by a former staff member of our church. When I came here, Chris Thornsberry worked on our staff. He's now a pastor and an associate at Epworth United Methodist Church. And he submitted a resolution that I want to read just a condensed part of it. The Indiana Annual Conference affirms that our allegiance as Christians is first and foremost to Jesus Christ and the reign of God, not to any political party, ideology, or nation. And this conference rejects Christian nationalism as a theological distortion that confuses the mission of the church with the aims of the state. And so we encourage clergy and laity to engage in faithful religious freedom that reflects the love, justice, humility, and mercy of Christ. And that passed by an overwhelming majority. We are called to live with the tension of being faithful citizens in a nation that comes with rights and responsibilities, but also understanding that we have an even higher allegiance to the kingdom of God that will outlast every human nationality. And I believe that those two do not have to live so far apart from each other. That when we live out our Christian values, we are living the best of what it means to be an American. That we care about the rights of everybody in our society while we care about protecting those who are a part of this country. That we care about the needs of everybody in our country while we hold on to this idea that everybody should have the right to prosperity and the pursuit of happiness. We're called to represent that, even more than others. As Christians who believe this comes from a God who creates every person. When Paul was speaking to the philosophers in Athens, defending his faith, he made this statement. God made from one blood all nations who live on the earth. We all come from the same source. We're all one people. We need each other. We're called to look after each other. That this is what makes America great. Let me close with this quick little illustration. We have a picture of a bridge in Peru. Just this past week, this very remote village in Peru carried out an annual tradition in which everybody in the village goes to strengthen and repair this bridge. It's made entirely of rope. Now, just down the river, there's a brand new bridge with steel. It's perfectly solid. Why do the people do this? Because it's an old tradition when this was the only bridge. And the understanding is every individual in the community has one part of that bridge that's theirs. It's theirs. So on repair day, the second week of June, everyone must show up, because if everybody doesn't repair their part of the bridge, it'll weaken the whole. Everyone's got a part. We all must do our part. It may be what it means to live like the nation God formed with Abraham, is to be a witness. to be a source of blessing to others as we live out what it means to do our part to the good of the whole. We're going to close with one of my favorite Kirk Franklin songs that helps us think about the needs of our world right now, that should not make us retreat, that should not make us look for a religion that helps us hide away from those needs, but to hear that in those needs is our call of faith, and I would also say our call as Americans.